Yeah, so I guess do you guys want to talk first just a little bit about what it was like living in Lawrence in the time that you did, kind of leading up to the sit-ins, and just kind of what it was like at the time?
We'll start. Well, I was born in 1952, sort of centuries ago, but it was a different time in Lawrence. In many ways, we were just emerging from a period of segregation. My parents, although they went to an integrated high school, activities such as any sports activities that required contact were separated by race. My father in particular wanted to play on the Lawrence High basketball team. He told one of the coaches that he wanted to play. And the coach told him, we have a gentleman's agreement amongst the coaches in the Sunflower League that no black players will play. And my father said, well, you're some damn poor gentleman. And he was promptly suspended from school. But my mother also experienced issues with teachers who openly stated to her that there was no way that she could achieve an A in class because black people were only capable of doing B work. And yet she taught there at Lawrence High School for decades, even though that was her opinion. The movie theaters had only recently desegregated. Black people could only sit in the balconies of the theaters. So it was a time when a lot of growing had to be done in Lawrence, and for black folks coming up, it was fairly residentially segregated. We lived in East Lawrence, which was a largely black community at that point in time. Coming up in school.
Well, let me just say,
go ahead.
When our family wanted to purchase a house, my father was a World War II veteran, but black people were not allowed to use government funds to purchase houses. It was explicitly written into the GI Bill or whatever. So it was a struggle to, houses help develop wealth and push you into the middle class. And while we got there, my father was a janitor for a period of time out at whatever the chemical company was that was here. And my mother worked for a small place where just women and electronics called Precision Devices. And they fought to get out of there and to give us the opportunity to go to schools. And so it was and part of it was going through. And when we went through Lawrence High, half the teachers we had knew our entire families. They knew my father, they knew my aunts and uncles, and everybody that went through it. So they knew what we were capable of, but we had to fight to get there.
And just one other thing about that time, which it actually gets extended for the issue of race and segregation really came to a head about a swimming pool, a public swimming pool. Mm-hmm. And there were swimming pools in Lawrence. It was a public swimming pool, but when the issue of whether it was going to be integrated or not, it was converted to a private club. So African Americans, the Jayhawk plunge, yeah. So African Americans could not be part of the club and could not swim in the pool. And I remember as a young child being brought with my mom and dad and John.
We were both there.
Out protesting with protest signs demanding that the pool be integrated. And I think at least 3 or 4 times there was a bond issue put before Lawrence voters about funding for a public pool. and it always got caught up in basically it's an integrated pool where white people and black people are going to swim together, and no, we don't want that. So it was voted down several times, and I think it was finally approved in maybe 1971, 72.
I can't remember.
When the public pool was finally built in the park.
Let me add that too, because part of this is not just Lawrence High. You know, some of the strongest memories I have are about my mother and father on the phone calling for, to find places for black students going to KU to stay because they could not stay in the dorms. And so if you were a black student to come into KU, you lived in a private home with another black family. Even though they had people like Will Chamberlain lived 4 houses down from us. In fact, we used to go down and steal his shoes off the back porch. I will tell you, I did run into him in Madison Square Garden, and I yelled out at that time we lived on Mississippi Street, our address, and so he stopped and came over, and I said, we used to steal your shoes off your back porch, and he said, I used to put them out there for you to steal. so even though there were, you know, black athletes and all that, it was not easy on any level in Lawrence. In fact, I came to Lawrence, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, and I went to get a haircut, and I asked the barber, I said, do you cut black hair? And he looked at me, and he's like, what? We cut all hair. And I realized I hadn't made the transition from the times when
you only went to the black barber.
You only went to black barbers. White barbers would not cut your hair.
Yeah.
And so it was that kind of environment that led to Michael, and he organized that whole group of people to take over the thing. Well, there'd been protests before and demands issued in '68 and so forth, but we hadn't gotten anywhere. It was Michael and his class that stepped it up a notch.
And there had been, as John said, there had been negotiations and talks about hiring more black teachers, doing something about African American history, doing something about the royalty setup where the prom queen and king was elected every year. It just only white people participated and no black folks participated in it. So there'd been talks going on for 2 or 3 years when John was here, and he graduated in '68. They had discussions. When I was here, we had discussions, and finally, my senior year in 1970, we felt like the discussions were going nowhere, and that the only way to actually accomplish something was to really protest in a way that would make people listen. And so there's about 20 to 25 of us decided to go.
Who was us?
Pardon?
25 of us. Who was us?
African American students, high school students. And we went to the principal's office and asked that he speak with us, and he declined. Well, we said, well, we're not leaving until you do. And thus began the sit-in and the calls for the police, and the principal called the police. I called my brother.
I was a student at KU in the Black Student Union at KU, and so he called, and I said, okay, I'll be right down. And when I got there, they had already taken it over, and we talked for a little bit, and then I called my father, and I said, Dad, Michael has taken over the principal's office, and I'm down here, and I'm going to bring some KU students down here, and we need you to come. And he worked at Hallmark Cards at the time, and said, I'll be right there. He came, and then they actually organized a group of called the Lawrence Branch of Concerned Black Parents, and they called all around. They gathered the parents in the park across the street, and we plotted our strategy, how we were going to support these. And I called students from the Black Student Union at KU who came down, and we just kind of mapped, well, okay, Michael and them are in there, what are we going to do?
And eventually it was negotiated that we would leave, but that the negotiations, especially with the parents and the school board and the principal, would continue. And the parents, of course, were working with us as well. So,
yeah. And I think that's one interesting point. Like a lot of our, leading up to this kind of project we were working on, a lot of our thoughts had to do with LHS has for a long time been very tied to Lawrence. You know, those two communities are very tied together.
Yes.
And how action taken at Lawrence High School within these walls can spill out to the entire community of Lawrence.
Yes.
So I was curious, like, what are you two growing up as members of the LHS community and the Lawrence community? How have you seen those two communities interact in those ways?
During that time, or?
Well, sure, but whenever, really.
So, you know, Michael described pretty well. I mean, black students, we were in an integrated school, and you had friends who were white, and there were a couple of Chicano students here, and you had them. But the integration, there was basically no social integration. You know, the black community was the black community, and we did what we did. At our parents' level, there were lots of efforts to try to deal with that. For instance, our father was running for the school board when Michael and them chose to take over the principal's office, and yet he came out and said, we're going to back you. They organized the Concerned Black Parents. Those parents did negotiate for us at all kind of levels, you know, including talking to Dolph Simons down at Lawrence Journal World, whoever ran the radio stations, and they reached into that whole area, but there was a resistance all the way through. And finally our parents came back to us over in that park and said, you know what, they're not going anywhere, do what you need to do. And so that's when we organized and said, we're storming the doors. And that's when they brought out the police and set up the police line and beat people and gassed us and all that kind of thing. So Lawrence High, people loved Lawrence High for, you know, the sports and the education. It was a good education. I mean, I still talk about now when people were sending their kids to private schools. I said, I did not go to a private school, but we got an education that equals all of that. And so I think you're very lucky to be able to do that. But
I would just say that there was a lot of similarities between the high school and the high school population and the city population. I mean, in the same way that Lawrence was at that time integrated, the high school was also integrated, but the black community was very insular, and there were so many things that we did within the black community that the white community didn't share, and we're probably not even aware of, I think.
They weren't.
Whereas with the white community, we were always aware of what they were doing, but we didn't participate in it either. And I think it was similar in high school. You know, the community was.
Well, you learned to speak two languages. You spoke the language at home, and then you spoke the language in the larger society. Yeah. And that was the language, the culture, the whole.
And so I do think that because I think those two things were sort of symbiotic and related to each other. So if you were going to change things in the high school level, it was going to affect how the white and black community related with each other outside of the high school, and vice versa. I think both of those things were true. But I think pushing that issue within the high school, it automatically became an issue for the broader community as a whole.
The entire community.
Yeah.
And 1970 was the year that was the year of the protests at KU.
Very tumultuous.
On a lot of issues, the war, racism, the connection with the high school, That's when they killed Rick Dowdell. They killed,
Oh, gosh.
I know his name.
I know his name
forgot.
too, but I
A
forgot.
white student at KU.
He was anti-war protester.
Yeah, an anti-war protester. And so,
Which they never solved, by the way. They never solved that.
no, they didn't. But so the time we're talking about, even though we're talking about the high school, all of Lawrence was. And then when you get to the summer of 1970 is when it actually became an armed protest. And again, there was an alliance between the black community and the students on KU, the black students on KU, but also with other groups protesting the war and so forth, all interconnected during that time. And we would talk with each other, we would negotiate strategies with each other, and then we would move. And when we were fighting in the black community, sometimes some of the groups would strategically do something and basically get the police called to go to the other side of town, to give us some relief.
Diversion.
Yeah. So even though we're talking about Michael and them doing the high school, this was a period of tremendous turmoil, both political thought, action in the streets, protests, and so forth. But it was for the whole United States at that time. Yes, when they killed 8 black students in Louisiana, and when they killed the 4 students at Kent State, or 5 students at Kent State, Ohio.
In Jackson State, Mississippi.
At Jackson State, Jackson State, they killed a black student. So it's a time that really has not been duplicated. And, I do know friends who said, I hated that period, and I loved that period, not because all these people were getting killed, but because people were fighting to reorient society so that everybody could be free. Mm-hmm. That was the fight that was taking place. There was resistance. They didn't want it, and so you ask, and then you have to say, we're putting our foot down and drawing the line, and we're not taking it anymore. And when that happens, then there's resistance, and you just deal with it. And that time is,
No, go ahead.
those times are coming again, by the way.
Yes.
Right now.
Yes.
So they'll look different, when we were doing this thing, we had mimeograph machines to roll off our leaflets. We could not call a protest, with our phones and get, 100 people there. We had to have people going out and organizing everywhere.
The closest thing you could see to it now, I think, are the George Floyd protests, because there was, again, it was a vibrant and important issue for the black community, but a lot of white people also saw it as an important issue, and an issue that they needed to take up. And it wasn't just a black struggle; it was a struggle for human rights, not just rights for black folks. So, but just like after the 1968, 1970, there was pushback. There's pushback against that united protest, and that's why I think now you see all the anti-critical race theory legislation, which is trying to.
It's a reaction.
It's a reaction to a united front of black folks and white folks and Native American folks and Asian folks against an injustice, and the anti-critical race theory people, I think, want to shatter that coalition.
And that's an overlooked thing too, because while we're talking about black and white, at that same time in Lawrence, there was a Chicano movement, Native Americans, and others who were trying to organize. They just never one, they just didn't have the numbers, and secondly, they did not have the visibility and support. So it kind of gets overshadowed, but that was as much a part of that whole time and what we were all fighting for.
You talked a little bit about how you had to get the word out and how that was like a different process, obviously, than it would be now. Can you talk a little bit more about like what the process was for, I guess, communicating and getting the word out about like, the protests and just communicating at the time about that?
Yeah, so, I mean, you actually had to organize people. So we would sit down and map out what our strategy was going to be, what we had to push, what the demands are, what we expected them, how we expected them to push back, and then how we were going to neutralize that. So, we would actually train individuals to be organizers, and send them off. Your job is to go, say on KU, but we sent them all over. We sent them throughout Kansas, frankly, and into Nebraska and Colorado and all that. But here, we'd send them to the dorms. Your job is to get the word out on this, on these dorms. This is what we're trying to say. Identify the people who are emerging leaders, talk to them. I don't care if you get 10 people. We may want 100, but if you bring 5, we take 5, right? And then we work with those 5 people, and those 5 people go out and do that. And then, of course, we stayed up night after night just mimeographing leaflets. And
it was all paper. Mm-hmm. It was all paper. There was no internet, no texting, no ability to communicate instantaneously, no camera phones that you can just
through that
good movies with and share with people that you're trying to communicate with. So I think part of your question was looking at a distinction between where we are today and what it was then. And if I was in that position doing that now, I'm not sure, because I don't think I'm not facile enough with the modern technology to really take advantage of it. But it would be a totally different exercise, and you could probably reach a whole lot more people a whole lot quicker.
I know you were relating it to that George Floyd movement, and I think that's one thing that was really interesting about that movement, comparatively, is that the virality of it. There were videos all over social media, and that was one of the big drivers of it, was that new age of technology and information, and the way that allowed that information to spread.
Yes, yeah.
And I think that there's value and maybe drawback in the way that information.
I think there are both. On the one hand, we really wish we had that kind of technology then. On the other hand, I think there was a tremendous strength in having individuals who were trained, not just responding because someone put the word out, but that you have individuals who are trained and dedicated to fight through every bit of that to get people. So it was more reliant on people, which is limiting in the sense, more reliant on organizers, which is limiting because you only have so many of those. But it would be how you would combine the two of those things that makes the difference. And I know there's also a difference now. There's more of a leaderless aesthetic in how you organize movements now. And I think that has some benefits and drawbacks. The benefits are they can't target you like they targeted Dr. King or, even me at one point. But at the same time, if that leader is able to live the reality of what they're preaching, then that is powerful in itself, and it draws people together. So it's not a disembodied idea. You see people who are living the roles that they're talking about, living the values they're talking about. So I think for your generation, figuring out how to fight for the values and pushing society forward, it's going to be how you combine those two kind of things.
And I think one thing that's interesting, kind of based on what you just said, that pushback and the way that can affect And I'm kind of curious, how do you kind of see how that's different now compared to how it was back in, you know, the 50s, 60s, 70s, and how that pushback looks different in these two eras?
Well, I think part of it, I mean, the pushback then
Was naked.
It was.
Just
And
naked.
it was really sort of brute force,
Mhm.
you know, taking a sledgehammer kind of thing. So this is like the FBI and the counter-intelpro process of disinformation and attacking, the FBI attacking Black Panther's office, seeding informants.
Inside, well, they say that the informants inside the Black Student Union.
Yes, they did.
Including one at KU.
Yes, yes.
And it was just, and it went beyond that. So, for instance, my mother called me one night, scared to death. She said, "I just got a message from some fraternity that they're going to kidnap you." And I said, don't worry about it, because we had our own protection and whatever. But it was that kind of blatant terror. Now, that still goes on today, but there's also much more sophisticated use of the media, that it's not just people who are fighting who can use social media to influence broad numbers of people, as you can well see with the situation we're in right now. So I think probably the main thing that distinguished it was just that it was a lot more just absolute naked force. Now the naked force comes from police when they use them to do that. The police were that, but it was ordinary citizens and so forth.
And I think that can kind of change the response, because, you know, you talk about like critical race theory legislation and stuff. That's less visibly abhorrent than, you know, straight up violence, but it still is very damaging in its effect, and how that can kind of,
Yeah.
you know, that can lead to less reaction because it's just less visibly difficult, but needs just as much of a reaction.
Yeah, and it can appear to be coming from people who are your friends,
Yeah.
whether it is or isn't. But it appears to be coming from people that you know or you're associated with. It comes to you on your phone, from some social network that you're attached to, and so it's much more insidious in that way, because it's not like J. Edgar Hoover saying blah blah blah. Because to me, well, it's coming from J. Edgar Hoover, I know I'm not going to pay any attention, right? But instead it comes from a bot somewhere that's gotten into my social network, and it looks like it's something that came to me personally. And I think it can be a lot more insidious. And
It's a lot more sophisticated way to play on fears, fears that some people don't even know they had.
yeah,
You know,
exactly.
So.
Yes, I just think about, and it's just so it plays on these fears that are really illogical. Because if you think about what's going on up in room 105 right now, where people are being taught American history, which includes African American history. I mean, who doesn't want their kids to know about what happened in this country? I mean, but they make it feel like, well, your kids are going to be made to feel uncomfortable. Your kids are going to be made to feel ashamed. Your kids are going to make, and so it pulls out this maternal and paternal instinct to protect your kids against something. And it's not about that at all. But that becomes the vibe that people feel as soon as they hear about it. And that is a much more, I just think, it makes their effort can become effective in a way that they couldn't have been if it was just J. Edgar Hoover making some statements on behalf of the FBI.
Or the Klan.
Or the Klan.
Just making their statements the way they used to make them.
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious how you guys think attending the protest with your parents when you were like really young impacted both your involvement in the Black Student Union at KU and then leading the protest at Lawrence High, and then also like your later life and careers. Like, how do you think that impacted your life?
They didn't mind bringing their 5 and 6 year old kids out with them to participate in that. And my father and my mother both lived that, even after growing up our entire lives here. They lived that there every day of their lives. We were constantly trying to make Lawrence a better place for them, for us, and for the city as a whole. That's why my father ran for the school board in 1971. He thought he could bring something that could make a change to Lawrence High and the broader community. And he was the first African American ever to run for that position, and so he was sticking his head up. And even though there were likely to be some consequences, both at perhaps in his job, perhaps on us who were still in school here,
he did it anyway.
He did it anyway because it was important. And I think for all of us that we sort of continued that thought. And for example, when after I finished school, I went to Texas and worked, instead of going to professional school immediately, I worked as a union organizer down in Houston, Texas. I was a machinist, member of the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, and ran machines and ran the Ford shop and made steel and organized workers. When I did decide to go to law school, eventually when I graduated, I became a public defender and fought for the rights of my clients and sought to uphold the Constitution and for a fairly marginalized group of folks. And when I became a judge, still, you fight to make changes in the judicial system to improve it for all of the people who are going to be served by the justice system. I think it's something that was instilled in us when we were young. Our parents lived the example of it, and we could not help but do the same, I think.
As did our grandmother.
That's right. We still have a letter that our grandmother wrote to the editor.
Yeah, she fought about
segregation,
education for black children back in the late 40s and 50s, early 50s, and so it was kind of in our DNA that we have to, if you see something, you have to say something. And as far as that impact in my life, so I became a hospital administrator, including the CEO of a hospital. I did a lot of work in developing countries, helping to build health systems, including South Africa, China, India, other places. But I will tell you that the lessons that I used to run my business all came from the stuff that we did at Lawrence High School and KU. How it is that you identify where the issues are, how it is that you organize your team, whether that team has 1,000 people in it or it's got 5. How you organize them so that, one, they believe where you're trying to go and they want to be on it. One of the things I used to, so if I'm getting ready to give you a difficult assignment, I would tell you this is the kind of things that you can expect. There's going to be pain in this process because this is not just going to be easy. And people used to say to me, my business, why are you telling people that, that's going to be painful? And my answer is because I want them to make the choice. You decide that you want to be part of this so that when the pain comes, you just fight through it. You know that it's there, and you've decided this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it. That's what we had to do here at the high school, at KU, and beyond. And that's what constitutes a movement as opposed to people just doing a task instead of just being employed. This is a job. Now, I'm asking you, are you willing to make a commitment to this thing? And if you are, there's nothing that we will not do together. I'm not ever asking you to do something that I wouldn't do. I'm not going to ask you to put your life on the line if I don't put my life on the line. And as weird as that may seem, you know, for, say, for a hospital, but when you think about when coronavirus strikes and other things, SARS and so forth, they scared the nurses and doctors and so forth together. They had to decide, we are going to continue to do this, all right? And so that's the kind of leadership that I learned from going through this struggle on these issues. And it's been my entire life. It's been, I graduated in '68, what was that, I don't know, 50-some years ago. I don't know, a long time ago, right? So, but those lessons have guided my entire life. I don't care what endeavor I was doing. So, yeah, it had a big impact. Big impact.
So you talked about the gymnastics championships and all of that. What was that like at the time? And with sports still somewhat segregated, if that's correct, I guess what was that like competing on the team while having that segregation still present?
Well, in gymnastics, I would have to say there was, John and I were on this same team for 1 year when I was a sophomore and he was a senior, and we were both on the gymnastics team, but we were the only two black folks on our team. But there were a few other black folks on other teams throughout the state, and so we were able to form friendships with them. But you know, the gymnastics team we were reasonably close, I thought. But again, I mean, there wasn't a lot of socializing. I mean, we
were teammates.
Yeah, we were teammates, and we were good teammates.
We didn't go to each other's houses or anything like that. But you know.
But we wanted to win championships.
We enjoyed it.
And we worked together to win championships.
So.
And we did, I mean, at that time, Lawrence, the gymnastic team, we had a string of like, we'd won 10 straight or something like that. And nobody wanted to break the string. No. Yeah. We busted our buns to make a contribution to the team so we could win. Yeah.
So I guess I'm kind of wondering with the sit-ins and the time at Lawrence High, were teachers and faculty supportive at all, or what was that like? And then I guess other students that were involved, was there any support there, or like not so much?
You know, that's a very good question, first of all, because I do remember that there were teachers that were very supportive, and there were teachers that were not supportive. I can remember, I guess the names probably wouldn't mean anything, but Dana Fambro was a supportive teacher. Mm-hmm. Barbara Thompson was supportive. I mean, there were just and interestingly, I remember that, you know, that in part because of that, and in part because they were just really good teachers as well. I have in my mind the name of a few, I won't name, but who were not. Yeah, and I don't, you know, I don't know that anti is exactly the right word, but I think there were two things that were going on. One is just, there were some who just thought the process, you know, they thought it was, you shouldn't engage in, you know,
protests.
Yeah, protests or demonstrations, like just sit down and talk to people. But to me, it was like, well, you're ignoring the fact that we have been sitting down and talking to people, and we haven't gotten anywhere.
For years.
And so this is why we're here.
Yeah.
So, but they just took the view that that's not how things should be done. So, other people, I think, were more black people should stay in their place, just stay quiet, you know. And there's a more of a racist sort of tinge to it that was very uncomfortable, and I did not have good relations with those professors, and some of it didn't become evident until the protests began. But
I think a lot of them, they were more absent, but the teachers that were supportive, and it's true, At KU too, we had professors for the black movement that were supportive, black and white. And they were crucial because, you know, we were young. We had experiences, but our experience was about this big, right? And yet, when you look at it, we were taking on the high school and the city of Lawrence, and taking on KU and the state of Kansas, and with no power and no experience. And those teachers and professors were advisors to us, you know. They weren't telling us what to do, but we could say, you know, we cannot, how do we neutralize? They're coming at us. How do we neutralize this? And they would be able to help us figure it out on our own. One professor we had at KU was actually from South Africa, so he had a ton of experience about protest and dealing with oppression and so forth. So that was a very good question, because as smart as you are and as determined as you are, at this age, you don't have the depth of experience. It doesn't mean you don't do it. You go on up and knock up against that wall and look at people who are sitting in power, because you think about it, KU, I don't know how much money KU had at the time, but you know, it's a $1 billion enterprise supported by the state of Kansas and the Board of Regents and all. Those are powerful people up there. And by the way, thinking of that, we actually did a sit-in, and there were multiple sit-ins before we did ours at KU too. Took over the chancellor's office, and
Yes, sir.
and actually there was a letter in the chancellor's desk that said, from the Board of Regents, telling him to, I want to say fire, but that wasn't, what do you do when you kick kids out of school?
Expel.
Me and
Expel.
three other individuals, and the chancellor had refused to do it.
Not that you were reading the chancellor's mail or anything. Not that you were reading the chancellor's mail or anything.
No, not that we were sitting at the chancellor's desk, no. And we did. And the chancellor, actually, Lawrence Chalmers at the time, was a good guy trying to figure out how to navigate all that too. I mean, because he was facing those forces who wanted one thing. He was, I think he was supportive of what we were doing, but his job was to run the campus. But anyway, we took that letter and we copied it and mimeographed it and put 10,000 copies out so everybody could read that, and which was a very big rallying cry in Poole. That's another way we organized. But so that the fact that you have teachers and professors who do that is very important.
Very.
Very important, and treasure them. I still treasure them. We're going to go see some after we leave here. You know, Bill Tuttle, who was professor for, I lost her name, I'm sorry, you know, your teacher.
Oh, Schrag.
Yeah.
Yes, Ms. Schrag.
Yeah.
You know, he sent me her thesis on the Lawrence branch of Concerned Black Parents, and because we stayed in touch, and that's been since 1970. Right? And there were others as well. So that was excellent.
And just knowing you have that support on, you know, because it's sort of when you're in that protest, and it just seems like the whole power structure is just sort of arrayed against you. And knowing that there's cracks in that wall, that there are people out there who are in support of what you're doing is inspiring. You know? So I really appreciate it.
It was like having the support of the parents, because our parents could have said, oh, we're working, you know, but they all left work and they all lined up in there and they said, no, we are behind you on this thing.
And they had their own risks associated with doing that too.
Yeah,
So.
yeah.
So.
Do we have any questions?
So earlier in this interview, you talked about how like now it's kind of like with the George Floyd protest, it's kind of like a research into like the civil rights movement and that stuff.
Mhm.
And you said it possibly or like go back to like having like we're in that time period now. What do you see for like the future of like this of the modern civil rights movement now?
Boy, that's a big question. Well, you know, I would just, in general, I see that we are getting ready to enter a period of really intense struggle.
Turmoil.
Yeah, turmoil and struggle. I think that there's an array of forces that want our society to be a different society. And I think it's fair to say that the principle that this country is founded on, the principle that Abraham Lincoln staked his life on, was the idea that all people are created equal. And I think there is there's a group or a
set of
force,
interests.
a set of interests
Yeah.
that want to defeat that principle once and for all and decide that no, there is inequality, and inequality is a good thing. There are people who should run society, and there are people who shouldn't run society. And I think limiting voting rights is a whole part of that thing, because certain people just shouldn't have a voice in government, and we should silence that voice. The whole critical race theory, anti-critical race theory is a part of that, because the whole idea is it enlightens people into perhaps why we have viewed, why there exists inequality, and why there is racial inequality, and what can be done about it. I mean, that's part of what critical is. If you don't understand why it exists, then there's no way to dismantle it. And critical race theory is part of it is just a way to explain how racism has become an institutional part of this country, and it's not just, a certain person calls another person bad names. That is not what we're talking about. We're talking about an institution that has codified racism within its own doctrines. It's like John was just talking about the GI Bill. I mean, even though it looks like a great thing on the surface, it was structured in a way that black people were excluded from it. So you could not grow any wealth, any generational wealth. And so if you want to talk to white folks about why some black people are in poverty and some are not, that's one explanation for it. But if you don't talk about critical race theory and institutional racism, you will never be able to explain that to people, and people will assume, well, those black people, they just have a problem. That's their issue. I mean, they need to bring themselves up by their bootstraps. Like my parents did. Well, your parents were able to take advantage of the GI Bill. My parent was not. That's an explanation. So they, I think we're into a period where there's going to be some intense struggle, intense fight about how are we going to view society and how are we going to structure society.
I think that I'm actually very optimistic. I think it's going to be painful. I think this is one of those times when you have to decide where you stand and what you're willing to take in order to move it forward. I think, and part of my optimism comes from the fact that nothing is a straight line in history. There's always pushback. There's always people that want to go back, 15 decades to where things were. But I think one of the reasons it's not framed just in a black and white issue now. You look across the spectrum of people, whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's women, whether it's Latinos, whether it's Native Americans. There is a growing understanding in society that all those things are linked now. and that everybody has to be, have the opportunity to be all that they can be, right? And that opportunity is not limited to a few seconds. That's a much broader, there's a much broader understanding and acceptance of that than there was 50 years ago, right? And even though all these groups have difficulty in coalescing, because you have to struggle to figure out how do you define the mutual interests, and then as Michael just said, now once we define those mutual interests, how do we find mutual action, and then mutual accountability and mutual respect? And what's the language that allows all of us to do that? Because I actually believe that the people that want to look backward represent a minority in this country, but they're powerful. It is a powerful minority, and they will inflict pain on us, all right? But I'm actually optimistic. We're going to take some setbacks. We're taking setbacks right now. The voting rights stuff is a big part of it. These anti-abortion laws that are going through are a big part of that. I mean, you can just name thing after thing. So those are setbacks we're dealing with. You know what? You're going to have setbacks. We're going to get hurt. If you get into a boxing ring, you're going to get hit. You have to choose to get into the boxing room, right? You have to choose to get into the fight. And if you choose to do that, and you have allies, and you have, I guess the other thing I want to add, we need to make much more use of the diverse talents that we have, because you don't have just fighters, right? There are some people who won't fight like that, but they know how to negotiate the differences between the various groups that should be aligned. We need diplomats, you know, people who know how to talk a language that allows different groups who need to be together because their real interests are the same to find a way to get together. I think we have a much broader array of that kind of talent. I think people in your generation have a lot more of that than we did. Yep. You know, and I think you have a much broader perspective than we did. So I'm actually very optimistic. It doesn't mean this is not going to be rough for the next 5, 10, 20 years. You know, it is going to be rough. But I think those interests are a minority, and that's part of why they're fighting so hard. They're scared to death.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it is a majority of people. So that is a basis for optimism for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So, what advice would you give to present-day Black students on speaking out on racial injustices? What is your advice? How should we go with it? You know, I mean, it's a tough question because I'm growing up in an age that it has nothing that can't even compare to your age, because we have all these things now. We have technology. It's a new society now. But even though all of these things are going on, you know, there are still things that need to be talked about.
Mm-hmm.
How should I go about that? What advice do you have?
You know, I think it sort of gets back to the basic thing. If you see something that you think is not right, that is happening in society or that is happening in school, then that's the thing you decide. You have a choice. You can ignore it and try to walk away from it, or you can decide to try to change it. And if you decide to change it, is it something that you can do yourself, or is it something that you're going to have to organize people to help you do? And most of those kind of things are things that you're going to need help doing that you can't do yourself. And so it's really about finding a group of people who have a common interest and helping organize that group into into fighting for the goals that you're trying to achieve. I know we're at a better point in many ways, and particularly in terms of race relations, a better point now than we were when I was born in 1952 and my parents were fighting, than it was in 1970 when we were here. I mean, just walking through this high school and seeing the changes that have occurred since I graduated. It's absolutely amazing. And even just watching the kids interact, I think there's just a much, it's the separate communities that I saw when I was attending school here. It seems like that may have broken down to some degree. I mean, I'm only here for one day, so I can't say that with any sort of authority. But I had a good feeling about the school as I walked through. But that doesn't mean there aren't things that still need to be done. And you're here, you would know exactly what those things are, I bet. You and your friends probably know exactly what those things are. And if it's things that concern you, get together, organize yourselves, and make a change.
You know, I'm going to basically say what he said. I'll just say it a little differently. I think you have to decide, this is what I want to do, and you do have to decide, I'm going to take the pain. And then Michael said find groups, but what you're really looking for are other individuals who are like-minded on that. And then you really need to sit down and dissect it, because you have to operate on two levels. You got to operate one on an emotional level, because that's where the passion and where you draw the strength to take any pain that comes or a setback. But the other is really need to talk through who is it that you are challenging. And now, how's the best way to challenge it? And what set of talents do I have to pull together to so that we can approach an issue? Because one of the differences nowadays, when we hit issues, we just hit them straight on, boom, you know. And you still have to do that. But today, you have to do that. But now you need to surround that frontal challenge with newspaper, media, multimedia, people,
The
internet. I mean, and so you need a group of people that say, okay, we're going to tackle this problem. How do we do this in an all-rounded fashion? And who's best at doing this? Because if I'm the one that's standing up there saying this is wrong and we need to change this, all eyes are going to be focused on you. But sometimes in those kind of situations, you're not talking to the person that you're challenging, even though you're talking to them. You're talking to all the people that are standing there listening. What you want them to hear is where you're trying to go and what's coming back at us. And then how do you shore that up? You shore it up with other people who can approach that, whether, you know, it's a poem that speaks to that issue, whether it's someone that puts out a short film that speaks to that issue, someone who writes an article that, I mean, that's what happened here. You wrote an article, right? And it just took off from there to the point that, you know, she's calling somebody from Seattle and to come out here and speak about it. But you have a tremendous amount of talent, and you guys are trained in much more sophisticated methods of communicating than we are. And so my advice is you have to nail it. Just be willing, find people who believe like you do, and then find multiple ways to nail it. A poster, you know, that says one thing, that drives your point home. You know, a poem, a film, a speech, a play, whatever. You're capable of doing that, and you have the tools right here.
Yeah.
And we didn't have any of these tools. So I don't know if that answered your question, but did I see a hand over there? No. What about, oh, they're not here. They're gone.
There you go.
Okay.
I lost mine.
It's okay. Can I ask, what was, I mean, I don't know if you had a chance to talk to your parents about this as they got older, but my impression of that era was always that it was sometimes hard for parents because they would face, sometimes job losses. What were some of their concerns? And maybe that you realized at the time, or maybe that you didn't even realize until you were older, but that they had to take that.
Go ahead. All right, I didn't fully understand your question. That's why I told her.
Yeah, she wants to know what kind of, were there repercussions for mom and dad and other parents for like?
Yeah, there were repercussions. I was arrested.
Oh, mom and dad.
Oh, for mom and dad.
Yeah, parents.
Well, yeah, there were repercussions for our parents. But they were versed well in how to navigate their way through society. And they pretty much mitigated most of it. So while I say there were repercussions, they had to battle their way through. Promotions, they had to battle their way through. My mother, I mentioned, was precision devices, and with this little bitty thing, and they had all these women who were ruining their eyes. And so my mother ended up being the director of the Minority Affairs Office at Kansas University. All right. But it was a long road to get there. And part of what she did when she was there was protect the legacy of what we did up on the campus. And she got a lot of pushback from that. The thing is, she was skilled in navigating her way through it. So in the end, the Office of Minority Affairs, its name has changed now, but it's still there. It is still helping Black and other students. And the same thing with Dad and the school board. My father got so much pushback for different policies and so forth on the school, but he was able to navigate his way through it.
I don't, as John said, our parents, I think, by that time, they had been involved in protesting for so long and had fought battles both in their, not only in the community, but within their own jobs of trying to get ahead and progress, that they had a reserve to fight any sort of pushback that came with that. Mm-hmm. I do think that there were other parents that were involved who did not have that. Mm-hmm. And I don't know of particular instances I don't know of particular pushbacks that came to them, but I remember hearing concerns expressed about if them taking public positions and their employers having a negative response to that. And the question for them was, were they going to do it anyway? And they all did.
They did it. Yeah.
They all did.
But a big part of their ability to do that was the Lawrence branch of Concerned Black Parents.
Yeah.
Because that group was initially formed to support us, but that became a support for other parents, for Black parents, period, in beating back any repercussions that were coming as well. Because it made a name for themselves. They could walk into the mayor's office, they could, go into whatever corridors of power as a group and say, look, this is what's happening, and we need to fix it. So while there were attempts at repercussions, I think they were able to mitigate most of it. There are probably particular things we wouldn't know because we were, they were adults and we were still
kids. At least in their view, we were still kids.
Yeah. Okay.
What is your response to when people
you're probably asking the two worst possible people. I have a Facebook account. I think I looked at it like 3 years ago. I recently got on Instagram, but I don't know what to do with it. I think it is a larger media issue, and I think President Obama is actually working, trying to find the way to deal with that. His is not specifically on racism, it's on disinformation altogether. But I do think social media is shaping our society, both the US and globally, in ways that were unanticipated. And there aren't the tools. And yet the people that control that are billionaires who basically dominate that space. They make those decisions. So I think it's going to end up being a governmental, it's going to have to be a governmental regulation of some kind over that. In the meantime, I think between now and then, I'm digging into what President Obama is saying, and I'm looking for leadership from him on how to begin to tackle this. Because nobody else is, I mean, the only people, the Congress people, I mean, so the Congress says they want to regulate it, and those folks come and tell them things that, one, are not true. Secondly, Congress people have no way of verifying it because they don't know anything about social media, all right?
They're older than we are.
Yes. So, you know what? Every generation has a task. That task is probably your generation's challenge. And you can learn from people like President Obama, who's more social. I mean, that's how he won his candidacy, by using social media as a big part of it. So he does. So I would say look for leadership from him, but I also would say the answer to that question is going to come from you guys, not from us. And you're going to think of approaches and methodologies and the challenge, the nature of the challenges. You'll understand the nature of those challenges better than we do. So you tell me.
Well, and I would just say, it used to be that, I mean, the idea was if people will put out disinformation about you, you just ignored it because it didn't have a long shelf life. And I think, I think one of the reasons why President Obama is addressing this issue is just the whole birtherism thing. I mean, the birtherism thing was out there, it was promoted, and he initially ignored it because it was obviously untrue and it's going to go away. But it took on a life of its own due to social media. And now, in the Republican Party, over half of the members of the Republican Party don't believe that he's not a citizen of the country, even to this day. So so I think one of the things he's looking at is, well, ignoring it does not work. You have to find another way to push back against it, and what ways can be most effective. There's the concerns about Twitter and people being blocked off of Twitter and trying to remove all kinds of hate speech from that. Those are really difficult questions. There are a lot of difficult balances that need to be struck. I don't think it being owned by Elon Musk is the answer, but I'm not sure what the answer is.
You know, one of the things that, and this is what we had to deal with when I said earlier that we had no experience in it. When I got to KU, I graduated from this high school, and I had the experience of this high school and living in Lawrence. Yet the forces we were tackling had, interest and experience that were vastly more powerful and wider than ours. And yet we had to figure out, we as the young people were the ones who said, we're going to push this door. We're going to push past this boundary. And we don't know exactly what we're doing, but we know it needs to be done. And I think nowadays, I think that's where you are. You don't have to know everything in order to challenge what's wrong. You have to know that it's wrong, and then you have to challenge it the best way you can. And then you have to pull as much experience as you possibly can from those who can guide and provide it. So I really do think on that question, Congress is not going to make the answer. The billionaires are not going to make the answer. I think it's going to be you guys and people like President Obama and the others who are out there that have some deep understanding of that. So I guess my message on that is don't be afraid. The coach of the Maryland women's basketball team told me one time, she said, you lead to the edge of the light. And so if you have a lamp and that lamp and you're going into darkness because that's where you have to go, you just lead to the edge of the light, and the further you push, the more, every step you take, that light advances. You see your challenges, you see the obstacles there, and you'll go around them, but you keep leading to the edge of the light. And I think, frankly, I think that's what you need to do as the young adults who are going to shape the next 50, 60, 70 years on the planet, and that you need to reach back to people like President Obama and others who, I don't know how long he's been out of high school, but it's not 50, 60 years, all right? Since he is closer to it than you are. So, closer to it than we are. So don't be afraid. You have what it takes to make the changes. You're going to change the world. Mm-hmm. So pick up that lantern and walk up. Okay.
I just got one more question. How do I find hope and optimism for the future when, time and time again in this country, I see more things go wrong than right?
I would just say if you look at, that's one of the great things about history, is you can actually look back and see, if you're interested in a particular subject, you can see where it started, and you can see how it developed, and you can see where you are now. And it took lives, it took fighting, it took struggling, it took educating, it took learning, it took loving, to get from a period of slavery to where we are now. It's easy where we're sitting now to not appreciate, because we still see so many things that need to be done. It's easy to not appreciate how far we have come as a country, but we have made tremendous strides. Even in my lifetime, I've talked about Lawrence when I was growing up versus Lawrence now. The United States when I was growing up versus now. It is a different place. In fact, when I was born, the idea that I could become a judge, it wasn't even on the table. There weren't any black judges. It just didn't happen. So just in my own lifetime, I've been able to take advantage of and appreciate the steps that we've made. That is going to continue. It will continue, and it'll especially continue as long as people such as yourselves, as John said, pick up the torch and lead to the light. And there are those among you here right now who are going to do that. And so John said earlier, he's very optimistic. I don't know if I'm as optimistic as he is, but I am as well. But when I'm feeling that things cannot go well, I take a look back and see from where we've come from, and I can't help but think it's got to continue.
There is, my answer was going to be basically the same, but there is a book that when I was your age that I read that inspired me and still inspires me to this day, called There Is a River. And I know the author, and I just not coming to my mind right now, but There Is a River, The History of the Black Struggle. And what it is a short history of particular struggles that took place from the beginning, and I can't remember whether it stops at the Civil War or after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, I can't remember. But when you read that book, or at least for me, when I read that book, I felt there was a river of history. And in the 1970s, I said, this is where I am in this river of history. And this is where I can make a contribution to these things. And it was precisely as Michael just said. It was about the victories, it was about the defeats, it was about the pain that was there, but the ability for people to overcome that. In this case, black people to overcome those things. And if you see yourself in that river of history, you will remain optimistic. It's difficult, you know. My sons are 40 and 43, right? And when all the protests, the Black Lives Matter, and the just video after video of black men and people being shot and killed, you know, they said, Dad, can we have a FaceTime call? And so we thought it was just going to be family, and they invited, like, I don't know, 15 of their friends who called in from all over the United States. And we just had a conversation about that, because they had to say, how can I be optimistic during this time? All right. And part of it is there is progress, but it has to be fought for, and it has to be paid for. And because nobody's giving it to you. They will not give it to you. So, and that's why I keep trying to emphasize, you have to make a decision of, is this what you want to do? Is this real for you? And then you have to make a decision, will I take the pain that comes along with it? Because when you win the victories, you'll feel it. I mean, it's exhilarating. It's the ability to push through the pain of winning those victories, right? And if you do that and you understand this is the flow of history, you're going to make your contribution. And that's what you have to do. You have to make your contribution. The reason we're here now is because we made particular contributions. We didn't ever expect to be, you know, it's been 50 years since I've been back in this building. All right. There was no reason for us to believe at that time that we would be back here for anything like this. There's no reason to believe that when we go to the University of Kansas at 2 o'clock to talk to the professor of the African and African American Studies department, which was formed through the struggle that we did then, that we would be there back for that. All right. What we did know is, you know what, if we don't fight, we get nothing. If we don't fight, we make no contribution. And we did. And some of us died, you know. But others, the vast majority of are still here, right? And so now we can speak from a historical perspective. Your day will come. I mean, your day is here now. There will be that day when you can look back and say, this is the contribution that I made. That's why you should be optimistic, because you have it in you. You just have to navigate your way through it. And that's the hard part.
But you will.
But you will. Okay.
We do have to. At 2 o'clock.
Is it?
Yeah, if you
Well,
guys need to.
Yeah.
If you guys
Luckily,
need to-
we have to get Terry in.
Yeah.
We have to have lunch. And, yeah.
Okay.
Well, I want to
Thank you
just
so
say
much.
thank you all for inviting us. I mean, this
in
was
Thank
particular,
you.
yeah.
was really, it's, as John just said, we never walking through these hallways when we were in this school, and coming back 50 years later in this way is just beyond comprehension, really. And so I really appreciate the invitation to be here, and I'm just so happy to have had this opportunity to meet all of you and to see what the school has become.
Well, we
So,
appreciate
thank
you coming
you
and
so much.
taking the time to talk with us. It really means a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.